My name is Enid Evans, and for the last 30 years I've lived in the beaches in Toronto, and before I was born in Knighton, Wales, and my name then was Enid Myfanwy Lewis. That's a Welsh name. I was the only child of Edgar William Lewis and Edith Mary Ingram. Daddy was born in I don't know when he was born. Mummy was born in 1902. So I think he was born in 1898. My dad was born in Knighton and my mother was born in Darlaston, which is the west side of Birmingham. I'll start with my grandma. Well, I used to call her Granny. It was my father's mother, Granny Lewis. And she was quite a character, I think. Apart from being very beautiful, she loved to play the game of the grand lady, and she'd dress up so beautifully on Sundays, and my daddy would drive her around the town because she'd had the cook bake some pies for the poor. So she'd deliver the pies and then afterwards drop in on a few friends. And don't forget there were no phones, so she had her calling cards that she carried in this little case, and if the person was out, she'd just leave her card. Then on to church. Well, all this activity had made her a bit late for church, but she didn't mind because she'd reserved a pew at the front of the church, and this enabled her to make a grand entrance. I think she must have been quite the fun lady. My grandfather I never met because he died in the First World War, so I never got to know him. My father and his mum operated a shoe shop in Knighton, Wales, and that is where he met my mother. She came to sing at the local chapel, and he was smitten with her immediately. So he asked the minister, could he take Miss Ingram out for a Sunday drive in his motor car? So, of course, the minister said it would be fine. So he took her out, and then they agreed they were going to write to each other. And she went back to the minister's house. Next morning, the minister drove her down to the station to catch the train back to Birmingham in England. And she suddenly spied my father running down the platform. He had a big box of Black Magic chocolates. They were decorated on the front with this lovely fan. And he gave them to her. And then after that, of course, they corresponded and eventually married. I was born in Knighton in 1927, and we lived there for quite a while. My mother didn't have anything to do. She played the game of the lady. She was bored, actually. And then my grandma died, and I was, let me see. Oh, they decided to sell the shop. It wasn't doing as well as they thought, and moved to Sedgley, which is close to Birmingham. Now, my mother lived with her parents in Darlaston, in Birmingham, and they had emigrated twice to New York before she met my father. They also had a sister, Mary, that lived in New York. And so when my first memories of my grandparents were going to Darlaston at Christmas time. We had a big Christmas tree, and they had real candles on it, which they lit, and all the adults sat around nervously. I can't remember whether they had a bucket of water, but they should have. And we had a farm scene under the Christmas tree. I was quite mystified when I saw everybody with nativity scenes under theirs. And Grandad had a hobby. He used to grow flowers, snapdragons, and he used to cut his friend's hair for free. So my Uncle Sidney used to say, you always know when people have been to Tom Ingram's, if you see them coming down the street with a bunch of flowers in one hand and mopping their neck from blood with the other. My Uncle Sidney played the harmonica beautifully. He painted and he whistled. He had the most wonderful whistle. We'd always know when Sidney was coming home. We could hear him way, way. It was a strong whistle and musical. And he'd be coming down the street and my grandma would say, put the kettle on. And my granddad also kept a little tin in the cupboard with something called brandy balls in it. That was a big treat. And when they put me to bed, too soon I always thought, I could hear the grown-ups laughing and talking downstairs. My grandma had a big rod and wooden rings, and I could hear them closing the curtains. Broom, broom. And then I was chosen as bridesmaid for my auntie Lenny. She got married and she chose me as the bridesmaid. And I was actually quite ill on the picture. You can see I'm not quite right. I actually had scarlet fever. And I remember them taking me and laying me on the table in the kitchen. I'm quite sick. And then after my mother was, when she was first married, she had me already, but she was offered a tour of England with a famous pianist called Mark Hamburg. And she was described as the delightful soprano. But the travelling life wasn't for her. She preferred being my mum. This is a picture of my mother and her mother and father and her sister and brother, Nellie and Sidney. I thought it was interesting to put this one in here because we've also got the trio, my mother, father and me. We've also got me and Chris and Tracy, my two children. So it was sort of a nice continuity there. And this is my mother on her first solo. She was very proud because she had a yellow taffeta dress, very swish. So she's on the stage, and while she's singing, she's sort of fed up because you can hear this tapping noise. Tap, 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 tap. She was thinking, what is it? And then she found it was her own heel. From nerves, she was tapping her heel. Now this is my parents as I remember them during the Second World War. And her parents, Polly and Tom. And this is the lane we used to walk down, Park Lane. It was a long way from the streetcar. We'd already been on 3 rides. We'd go on the double-decker bus from Evesham, where we lived, all the way down to Birmingham. That was only 30 miles, but it took 2 hours. I was always bus sick. It was terrible. And then we'd walk across Birmingham onto another bus, would take us to Walsall. We get off that, another bus to the top of Park Lane. Then off the bus, my daddy would be carrying an enormous leather suitcase which weighed a ton before you put anything in it. He'd carry it all the way down. Oh, it was such a long, long way. That was my grandma's house in the distance. She had a neighbour who used to keep chickens and pump gas. What a funny cross career. And the chickens laid eggs, of course, and my grandma used to send me to Mrs. Dooley's for eggs, and Mrs. Dooley let the chickens in the house. And then when you went for eggs, she'd say, look, just a minute, I'll find you some. And she'd reach down the side of the chairs and, oh, here's a nice warm one. Imagine. And I'd take them in a little basin back. This is my grandma Ingram, Polly Ingram. Her real name was Mary Ann, but she was called Polly. This portrait hung in her living room all the time I ever remember. And Granddad was one side of the clock and she was the other side. But they lost my granddad's picture after he died. I think it went mildew in the garage, but I managed to save Grandma's, but it wasn't in very good condition. This is my dad in his heyday, looks like quite the handsome hero to me. And this is my parents in Bedford. We lived in Bedford for a while. This is my mum and dad looking very stylish. This is me, pre any knowledge of style. And this is the dog. I don't know whether his name was Jumbo or Jip, I can't remember. And when we lived in Bedford, my dad managed a shoe shop there. It was next door to the cinema. Well, every morning I took my dolls, my teddy bears and my gollywog, and put them on the steps of the cinema and had a lovely time playing. In those days they used to have a superintendent standing on the steps of the movies in a uniform. Well, just before the matinee time he said, "Time to go home now." And so I'd take my pram, put all my dollars in it and go home. I really remember that. This is Evesham in Worcestershire. We moved there when I was about 5, I think. And it was a beautiful market town, and the main thing they grew was plums. So in the spring the plum trees were a fabulous sight from the higher hill, just masses and masses of white blossoms. And they also grew asparagus. I remember just before we moved there, I used to play in a neighbour's shed. She didn't know, but I was able to turn her shed into a spaceship when she was busy in the house. And I would go in there. She had a big mangle, like my grandma's mangle. And she used to, I used the big wheel that you turned it with, the iron wheel. That was when you went up. And then when I wanted to return to Earth, I'd turn it the other way, we'd come back to Earth. There was a little window I could look out of. Well, the woman used to come back and she never knew this secret travel. So this is Evesham again. And my dad's store that he managed up here was called Hewins. And it was a 3-story building. And my playroom was on the top floor. So anyway, the hapless help that he had to come and see my concerts every month. I had it all set up like a little theatre. There was some curtains you could draw across, and that was the stage. And then they had to pay. There was a penny to sit on the chairs, but there was the balcony. It was expensive. It was 6pence, and the balcony was actually a big packing case with a chair balanced on the top. Must have been quite an alarming experience, not to mention boring. Little girls' concerts aren't the best, I don't think. This is my daddy, was the manager of the football team. We think it was in Evesham, but he was very active in football when he lived in Wales too. He was quite the sportsman. He loved cricket as well. I used to see him down at the cricket grounds, and he'd be standing in watching. He'd have his blazer on, you know, and then when somebody did a good shot at the wicket, I don't understand cricket myself, but he'd say, "Oh, well played, sir." And he had to say it like that. He couldn't just say it the other way. And then he and my mother, they used to play tennis quite a bit. Well, in those days, you couldn't play tennis unless you wear your whites. Of course, the whites weren't drip dry like we have. You had to wear these very heavy flannel trousers that had to be dry cleaned. So underneath his zeal for the game was the worry all the time that he might fall down and get grass stains on his trousers. But I never could play tennis very well, but they had a good time with it.